Hello, friends. We're starting to go live, and I'm putting my books back. Okay, here we go. I'm live. Here we are. Now we're all here. Hello, everybody. We're live, and hello to people that are going to be tuning into this after the fact. Thanks for being here. Oh, I have my nice lights up, and I didn't even plug them in. We don't even have our nice sparkly lights. Should I go plug in the sparkly lights? They're going to be distracting? Questionable. I'm going to go turn them on, because why not? Hold on. Okay, here we are. Hi, Robin. Nice to see you. We're all just getting set here. I've got my sparkly lights turned on now. This is a very undecorated corner of the apartment. So there's not a lot to look at, but hopefully you like my sparkly lights. All right, before we get going, let me make sure that I've got everything set up so people can see. Hi, Nikki. Good to see you. All right, let's see. Ugh, y'all, they won't give me a thing to share. Let's see. Well, I'll have to share it after the fact. That's okay. Sorry, the first couple minutes are always me getting everything organized. Because once you go live, then you have to put everything everywhere so people know what's going on. There we go. Okay. All right. Oh, yay, nice. Thanks, Robin. I appreciate that. Thanks, Raven. I love my sparkly lights as well. We have them. They're the one part of our Christmas decorations that we don't take down after Epiphany. So I like to leave them up because sometimes you just need the cheeriness in the winter, it's cold out. It's really cold here in Minnesota right now. And you just need some little sparkly lights and candles and stuff. So, that's where we are. Okay, cool. So we're here. I'm so glad you're here. People are going to be kind of popping in and out. We are talking tonight about 1 Corinthians 12, chapter 12, verses 12 through 26. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So if you have a Bible around and you want to pull that out, or if you have an online one that you'd like to use, I'm a big fan of both Bible Gateway because it has a lot of different, a lot of different translations. But then it's also got a lot of different, the translation things. That's the best part. The other one I like is BibleHub.com, and that one's got a lot of, you can go interlinear on the Greek, on the Aramaic, on the Hebrew, whatever you want to look at, and that's really helpful for people that are big geeks like me. So if you want to pull that up, 12 through 26. I'll send out a little link here for people who want it in the chat. There we go, on the one that I'm reading. There's the one I'm reading if you want that one. But that's what we're going to be reading tonight. And my first sort of, I think what I want to do first is kind of what we did last time, where I'm just going to read through the whole thing the first time. And then I want people to popcorn out what they have heard out, what's stuck in their mind right away. Hold on, I have to moderate the chat. See, this is the problem with, this is the problem with trying to moderate and type at the same time and do this. I got to find a way to assign a moderator, which I may do as things get more. I hope we get a lot more interaction as we keep going, that people will kind of get involved. But I think, so what I want to start with is I'm going to read the passage and then have people pop out and talk about what they've heard, what's really stuck in their mind. So let's go ahead and read. So this is 1 Corinthians 12 through 26, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. The other thing that you can do if you want to read from a different version and you want to tell us what you found that was different from the version that I'm reading, that's always really interesting. And we can talk about why those differences exist. So, New Revised Standard Version for this one. All right. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in the one Spirit we are all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we are all made to drink of one Spirit. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot would say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear would say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, or the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, so that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. So that was a long reading, longer than our one last month. And there are parts in it that kind of repeat. Like you can hear sort of the cadence that Paul is speaking in, where he kind of repeats these same phrases over and over. So what, if anything, jumped out at you in there? Were there words or phrases or anything that you kind of went, that's weird, or that's interesting, or I wonder what that means? So that's what I always want to start with. So I'm going to watch chat. I'm going to keep talking, but I'm going to watch chat. So y'all put stuff in chat. The first thing that I think is helpful to know about this passage is that it was probably originally given like Paul wrote in a style that was like he was delivering a speech. And so you can kind of imagine that one of the reasons that he says things, he kind of tends to say the same thing several times over, is because he's trying to emphasize something, because these letters were read aloud. So like Paul wrote them like a speech, because when the group in Corinth would receive a letter, one person would stand up and read the whole letter aloud. So like if you are hearing something, it's helpful to get the thing several times so that you can really take it in, like if you're hearing a sermon, right? So that's kind of why he does that. Shannon says, where would the body be? Stuck out to me. And Robin said, many members. And hi, Aaron. Nice to see you. I think, and Raven said, all suffer together or rejoice together. Yeah. I think that actually, Shannon, speaking to yours specifically, I think that sentence that Paul writes is a really interesting one, because he said, let's see, if all were a single member, where would the body be? Like it's kind of a weird sentence. Like he's clearly trying to make a point. Like obviously there is, if everything were different parts, then there would be no one thing, right? But it's just kind of a funny way to write that, I think. And Anita, hi Anita. The weak are indispensable. Yeah. Yeah, Aaron, you're not missing too much. We're just reading through 1 Corinthians 12 through 26, and talking about what stands out to us. Let's see. Raven, we're going to touch on yours, I think. I've got a couple of questions on that coming up here. Shannon says, we miss out on so much without diversity in the body. Yeah, so that's kind of the sort of focus, I think, for what I was thinking about with this passage, because I often use this passage. I often speak about this passage when I'm talking about the necessary diversity in churches, because I think a lot of the time we tend to think of, like, especially in churches that sort of tend to operate more like companies, where it's like diversity is sort of an initiative, like we got to do it, I guess. But really, diversity is seen as a really positive thing in this sort of metaphor that Paul is putting out there. Yeah, true, Marvin. It wouldn't be a very good body if everything was a hand. So that's really kind of where my initial connection to this passage came from, was that idea of like diversity is good and we need diversity in the body because we have different gifts, right? So I want to zoom us out a little bit to what Corinthians is talking about in general and to the idea of this body metaphor. I'll throw this link in the chat here to this nice reflection on this passage from Christian Feminism Today, which is their LGBT inclusive folks that talk about seeing the Bible through a feminist lens. And they wrote, who was it that wrote this passage? Rita Altman Finger wrote this passage. It's great that her last name is a member of the body. That works out so well. No, but she wrote this reflection on this piece, kind of talking about where it's a good sort of small summary of what was going on in Corinth at the time that this letter was written. So like what we know about Corinth is that one of the reasons Paul was writing to the people at Corinth in 1 Corinthians and then 2 Corinthians was because they were having these schisms within these, like this tiny church, right? And the schisms tended to be between people that had more and people that had less, like high class, low class. It was sort of a socioeconomic split that was happening. And Paul was trying to keep everybody together by writing these letters. So throughout his letters to the Corinthians, you get these metaphors, especially in 1 Corinthians, of the importance of everybody being together, and then the importance of diversity and like allowing diversity within that church body. So that's sort of like the larger setting that we have here, is that we've got the people in Corinth who are kind of like, we've got people that are better and people that are worse. And Paul's like, no, you're all necessary. And you all have gifts to bring, and being together is important. So that's the bigger sort of picture we're looking at here. Yeah, let's see. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat now. Raven says, when you consider the image of God being in everyone, you can also see more facets of God in a diverse group of people. Yep. And then Robin says, the members of the body which we deem less honorable, on these we bestow more abundant honor. I thought this was very impactful. Yeah. Okay. So I've got like a whole list of questions, and I'm just going to jump around with what people bring up here. So connecting to that sort of setting in Corinth, right, where we've got this socioeconomic split happening, what Paul is saying here in verses, 22 through 24 or 25, I guess it is, Paul's doing this very like socialist moving around of honor as capital, which is a really interesting thing to see. But he says, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. On the members of the body we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor, so moving that honor around. Our less respectable members are treated with greater respect. God arranged the body, giving greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension. And so we've got this kind of interesting movement of social capital in a sort of sense, but it's in the sense that in Greek and Roman society, honor was almost like a thing that you sort of like you accumulated it, and it meant a lot more in the way that wealth, I think, kind of means a lot to us today. I mean, those things are obviously connected both in the ancient world and now, but I just think it's really interesting, this idea of like moving honor around. So I guess the sort of question that I have around this is like, how do we understand the movement of honor when we think about like individually as like individual humans, and then communally? So I guess the larger question I have around this whole passage for us to sort of contemplate is, how far do we take this body metaphor? Like, how far can the metaphor go before it stops working? Because when we talk about, when Paul talks about using the body as a metaphor for a group of people, like we kind of get what he's saying there. But then if we take it to an individual level and we start talking about our individual bodies, then we have to bring in a lot of things that we might not have thought very much about. Like we have to think about how this sort of metaphor works when we think about people with differing abilities or disabilities. We have to think about how we talk about this through like a trans lens, because for trans folks, there may be parts of our body that we do want to get rid of in some way through gender confirmation surgery. And so in that way, this metaphor kind of doesn't quite work it doesn't work the way I think it was intended. So there are limits to the ways that this metaphor works, but I think they're interesting and important to talk about. So for instance, let's just think about the words that Paul uses for, like the more negative words Paul uses for the body, right? So Paul talks about, he uses the words weaker, less honorable, less respectable, and inferior to talk about certain parts of the body, right? And a lot of those words have to do with sort of the social ideas about bodies. Like when Paul says, let's see, the members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor. Like that's essentially talking about the parts of your body that you can't just run around outside without clothes on and not be arrested for indecent exposure. Like, well, essentially he's saying like we clothe the parts of our bodies that are most sensitive, right? Like culture-wise and body-wise, I suppose. And so what's sort of what I think about that is this, it brings up this question of like, are parts of our bodies really less honorable, or are those social constructs that might be more negative? Like, are those social constructs we need to break apart, that parts of our bodies are more negative or have less honor? Or is that really true, that parts of our bodies are more negative? Like, does that make sense? So I'm kind of wondering about y'all's thoughts on that, about like, is this a nature or nurture, or a nature and nurture scenario? Are there parts of our bodies that might be considered less honorable or weaker or inferior in the way Paul uses those words? Does that make sense? Raven says, I think it's a social construct. Yeah, I tend to agree. I think, yeah, Anita says honor is culturally mediated. Accurate. Robin says, I'm leaning more towards social constructs in regards to parts of the body. Yeah, so a lot of this, like, because we can look at like ancient Roman society and we know that the honor system then worked differently, we can recognize that some things were culturally different then than they are now, right? So like we recognize that some parts of this are culturally constructed, and especially when it comes to things like honor, when it comes to what is respectable in some cultures is not respectable in other cultures. And we see that in clothing too, right? Not all cultures clothe the body in the same way. How about weaker parts of the body? Are there really weaker parts of the body, or is that like when we think about, it really depends on how we define weaker, right? Like, can my first finger lift as much as my whole bicep? Probably not. But is that the way in which Paul was speaking about this? I'm not sure. Robin says, have you ever stubbed your toe? True. Your toe is definitely a weaker part of your body. Yeah, I think the idea that we have weaker parts of our bodies in terms of like the strength that we would, how do you calculate strength in physics? I'm trying to remember. It's like strength is movement over distance divided by time. Does that sound right? I'm trying to remember my high school physics. If anybody's a physics major, let me know in chat how you determine strength. But yeah, so if you've got that kind of strength, yeah, we can go with that. In terms of how Paul is using it in this metaphor, I'm wondering who he might be referring to. If we're looking at the body as like a group construct, who is Paul referring to when he talks about people that are weaker or less honorable or less respectable? Oh, thank you. Work equals force times distance. Thanks. That's what I was going for, was work. Shannon says, Clement expands, let the strong not despise the weak, and let the weak show respect unto the strong. Yeah, so we've got like other ancient sources and not so ancient sources that kind of mirror this idea of like society only works when we don't look down on each other. I mean, it only works well, I suppose I should say, when we don't look down on each other for certain things. And so we've got Paul kind of saying that same thing. One of the things that is pointed out by Rita Haltman Finger in that article that I linked is she talks about how in Corinth at the time, the people that were seen as lesser were probably the Jewish folks who were of the lower class and were probably what we would think of as like blue collar workers, whereas the Gentiles that were being brought into this new Christianity thing were the people that were higher class and had more wealth. So in this disparity that you see in the Corinthian community, you not only have the socioeconomic difference between the rich and the poor, but you also have the difference between the Gentile and the Jew, right? And the slave and the free and that kind of thing. Yeah, Raven says probably the sick and the disabled. Yeah, so like folks, one of the things that we know about early Christian communities is that they were one of the few places where, for instance, widows and orphans, because we have like all of these Bible passages that tell us about how important it is to provide for widows and orphans, right? And the early Christian churches were like, that sounds good, let's do it. And then they would get into huge trouble with the Roman Empire because they were giving resources to these people that were seen as lesser than and not useful in society. And so the same thing would happen with people who were sick or you know, had different like mobility issues. So they would definitely be included in here as well, I think. So what Paul is kind of trying to say is these people really aren't the, or even if they are people that you think of as weak or inferior or of lesser honor, they should still have the same amount of honor that the greater parts have. Another thing out of this great article from Christian Feminism Today that she points out is that this metaphor of the body was used in Roman, what's the word? Sort of like, it was sort of commonly used in Roman society to talk about how the social stratus was layered up. So like, it's kind of like how we still use the phrase like head of the household, right? If you're the head of the household, you're kind of the person with the most power, you're the leader, whatever. So that's a body metaphor, right? You're the head. So we still use that. And in Roman times, they used it to say like the leaders are the head, they do the thinking, right? Whereas for instance, like the soldiers that were the feet of Rome, right? These people that had specific jobs, it would kind of end up being like, if you were of a lower class that did manual labor, you were the hands of the empire, right? And that was not as great a job as being the head of the empire. But what Paul is doing is specifically kind of taking that model of the Roman world and saying, well, okay, we are all different parts of the body, but all the parts of the body are equally important and all the parts of the body are equally necessary. So he's taking this Roman power structure and kind of saying like, let's use this metaphor differently. Let's talk about this power structure as if we are all equally important. And what might that look like? So Paul, I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you. I'm not crazy about Paul, but I'm getting to like him a little bit more when I see the ways that he's really changing the sort of the whole structure of the empire in his time. I appreciate that. Okay, I gotta like get my head down to where we're going here. So speaking of how those different like layers of society work, where you've got like the Greek and the Jew and the slave and the free and the richer people and the poorer people, right? We see that right in the very beginning of this passage, and this will probably sound familiar to you. Verse 13 says, "For in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit." Does that sound familiar to anybody? Because it's the same thing that Paul says in Galatians, basically. Galatians 3:28, which is the verse that I think a lot of us are familiar with because it's the one that includes male and female. We are neither male nor female, or male and female, because we are one in Christ. So I think a lot of us are probably familiar with that verse. But Paul's basically doing the same thing here. These are sort of the two times that he does that, where he says, yes, we have all these social identities, but we are all one in Christ, and that's sort of the uniting factor, even though we have all these things that differentiate us. if you're familiar with N.T. Wright at all, he writes a lot about the New Testament, and he did say something really disparaging about trans folks once. So if you feel negatively about that, it might kind of turn you off his writing. But he does have some really good scholarship on Paul, and one of the things that he says is that Paul's point in both Galatians and here in 1 Corinthians with the baptism thing, he says that it's not really about individual identity and like your individual identity changing. He says it's more about understanding the identity of the Christian community. This is sort of my question for you all. What do you think about this idea of baptism as changing the individual and changing the community? Because essentially what N.T. Wright argues is that baptism changes the community because you're letting in this new person, and sort of like it widens the boundaries of the community, and it also changes the makeup of the community because you've let in a new thing, right? So it's changing everything. It's like putting a new ingredient in a soup. Suddenly it tastes different, right? So how do you all think about baptism here in this context? Is baptism something that changes an individual when they get baptized, or is it something that changes the community, or is it both? What do you think about that? What does baptism do for a person and a community? I'm gonna let you think for a minute while I have a drink of water. And I know that's a big question, considering it's like, you know, a whole tenet of the faith, this idea of baptism. But Lachlan says, I see baptism as a public acknowledgement of acceptance of my of faith. Robin says, I'd say both off the top of my head. Raven says, both. When you consider that baptism is usually done in public, I think it's mostly a community change. That's a good point. Like, sort of, is the baptism done in view of everybody on a Sunday morning or whenever, or is it done kind of individually someplace else where the community is not bearing witness to that? Dan says, baptism is an outward and visible sign of the grace of God, which brings an individual into a community which, and we're going to get to the end of that thought in a minute, I bet. Dan, you're going off you're speaking right to the catechism there, I see. Outward and visible sign of the grace of God. Yeah, if you memorize the catechism growing up, that might sound a little bit familiar to you. Yeah, I want to see what else Dan's going to say there. But yeah, so we've got this idea of baptism from Lachlan's perspective. It's like that public acknowledgement of your own personal acceptance. And then as Dan says, it's an outward and visible sign of something. So like, we're kind of getting this dualism here of like, it's an outward and visible thing that other people see. And so it can change community, but it also changes, or it says something about who you are, right? So it's an outward sign of an inner thing that happens. Raven says, I think in the West, we're individualistic and easily forget how community-based Christianity is. Yeah, I agree. I think this idea that we read everything in the Bible and assume that it's speaking directly to us exactly as we are without taking like maybe the community context into account can be a really rough way of reading. Dan says, hold on. So got to go back to your last thing you said, Dan. Brings an individual into a community which takes responsibility for the spiritual formation of that individual. So both, which is why I love the concept of infant baptism in my denomination, the UMC, United Methodist Church. Yeah, so that's another thing that's interesting when we talk about baptism, right? Is we have some denominations that talk about that do baptism for infants, and then some denominations that only do adult baptism. Shannon says, baptism is like a welcome to the family, and everyone is an adoptive or foster parent. Everyone gets changed. Yeah. This idea about baptism as something that is done sort of to you or for you, or then something that you do yourself is really interesting. Bill says, the other side of what happens with baptism and what is when we do baptism. Yes. Okay. So let's go with what Bill's talking about here for a second. So we've got denominations that do adult baptism, and that's kind of like what Lachlan was talking about, where you do baptism as an affirmation of your adult faith. Like you say, this is what I believe. I'm doing this in a community that is sort of bearing witness to that faith. And then there are congregations that baptize infants, and the idea in those denominations is that baptism is a recognition of something that God has already done for us, like Jesus has already done for us. And so it's like you don't even have to be completely cognizant of being a human in order to accept that gift. It's already given to you. And that's why a lot of folks have infant baptism, a lot of churches that do infant baptism and have a confirmation process later in life where as a teenager, usually or a young adult, you say like, I recognize all the promises that were given to me in baptism, the gift I got in baptism, and now I'm making a personal affirmation of my faith. Raven says, I was baptized as a baby and an adult. Wow. 2 for 1. Yeah, so we've got this idea of baptism in 1 Corinthians specifically as a uniting factor, right? Something that kind of says, once you're baptized, you're just in, and you don't have to do anything else. You don't have to change your social status. You don't have to change your religious status in terms of like if you were born Jewish or you were born Greek. You don't have to change anything about you once you are baptized. You're just in, and you are kind of one. And that's one of the things that we, like the community in Corinth was struggling with, was like, okay, we're one now, but we have all this internal strife going on, right? And we don't know what to do with that. How do we stay one when we have all this internal strife going on? Robin says, oh, hang on. Robin's going to keep typing there, so I'll leave that for a minute. So yeah, with the individual strife thing, I think that's something that is really, what's the word? It's relatable, I think, to a lot of Christian communities right now. The United Methodist Church, of course, being the one that I think is having the biggest struggle at this moment about whether or not to affirm LGBTQ plus folks. And it's like, what's the balance between staying one in Christ, one in baptism, one as the church? Like, when is that the thing that needs to prevail? Or when do we have to recognize that we have to split or change something in order to do what we believe God is calling us to do? So like, I think that's something that we're definitely seeing in the UMC, but it's something that I think we're seeing in a lot of churches right now. Like in my church, which is the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we had that kind of happen around LGBTQ folks in 2009. And now it's something that we're really struggling with when it comes to racism, because we are a very white denomination. And talking about racism is not something that makes people very comfortable. And so we're trying to figure out how to be a community, how to be one, when wrestling with things that it makes everybody uncomfortable, but like it's a necessary conversation we have to have, right? Lachlan says, on that line of thought, don't you have to change your works? Oh my gosh, don't even get me started, because I'm a Lutheran and I go into this whole law and grace and it's just the whole thing. I think the prevailing idea is that when you talk about, like, for instance, if you are an adult and you're like, I'm going to get baptized, I'm going to affirm what I believe, it's this outward sign of grace, then the idea is that you change your works based on the fact that grace has already been given to you. So it's not that you have to change your works in order to earn love or earn grace. It's that it's like an automatic outpouring of gratitude once you realize what you've already been given. So that's the official Lutheran answer, I think. So like, you do change, but you change not because it's a requirement for membership, but because it's a part of the new life that you live as a Christian in community. I hope that makes sense. People can elaborate in the chat if you want to. I'm getting on a tangent again, y'all. So I want to bring it back to this sort of larger theme of affirming our belonging. Oh, and I want to recognize that it's 8:35, so we've been going for half an hour, and I feel like we just got to go the full hour. I hope you all are okay with that. Drop in, drop out, it's chill. But last time we just did half an hour, and it was so short, so I'm going to go all the way to 9 o'clock my time tonight. But let's go back to this larger theme. of acceptance, because I think that's what's so powerful about this text for a lot of us. So I want to hear from you what, like, when you hear this metaphor of like every person or every member is needed in the body of Christ, and there are different gifts, and this is, if you expand, if you expand in chapter 12, and read on a little bit past verse 26, you'll see that Paul then goes into all these gifts, right? He talks about spiritual gifts right at the beginning of the chapter and then talks about them right at the end. So I'm just going to read 27 through 30 really quick. Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then deeds of power, then gifts of healing, forms of assistance, forms of leadership, various kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? But strive for the greater gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way. That last bit of this chapter is confusing to me, and I think to a lot of people, because Paul is at the same time saying, you're all equal, but then he lists off like who's first, who's second, who's third. And then he talks about which gifts are greater. And so there's this weird dissonance between like, wait, Paul, I thought these were all equal. And then he kind of lists things out in a weird way that makes them not seem equal. Let's see. Okay, Robin says, in this way, it makes me think of saying that all is one and one is all. The individual is initiated into the kingdom and part of a larger Christian community. The community is made aware of how large the kingdom actually is. There are aspects of creation that were completely foreign to the community that God has revealed to his people. True. So you've got this sort of tension, it looks like you're saying, Robin, between the individual changes the community and the community changes the individual at the same time, which is, I think, kind of, yeah, what we're going for here. Raven's responding to Lachlan. Let's see. Once again, Dan is in there with the catechism. Okay, so Lachlan says, a lot of the time, especially in my church, people see it as more important to accept but not encourage LGBT people rather than accept them, and then in their baptism, also should people from this perspective just accept people and aim to critique exegesis later? Yeah, okay, so let's break that down a little bit. I think that's part of what's going on here in this passage, because I can imagine that what might have been happening in Corinth is the people that were sort of higher status and had more honor were accepting the people who had less honor into their like into the body. They were kind of saying like, sure, you can come in, sure, we'll accept you, but you're still going to be lesser than, right? You're still going to be the feet rather than the head. And I wonder if that isn't exactly what Paul is kind of going for here, where he's saying like, once you're accepted into the body, you're done. Like, you're equal to everybody else. It's a very sort of democratic acceptance level or rate. And so I wonder if people that are kind of saying like, you can come in this far, but you're still not allowed to be full members of the church because you're LGBT, you're not allowed to serve communion, you're not allowed to be ordained, like you're not allowed to be a full member of the body. That's kind of anti to what Paul seems to be saying here about everybody being equal once they are accepted. I think maybe, I don't know, I need to do some more research into like the use of and treatment of slaves in the Greek and Roman world, because I don't know enough to speak on it, to be honest. But to me, the sort of the fact that slaves were essentially considered free people within Christian communities, like they would be a slave when they went home, but the minute they go into a church or into a house church, that signifier of slavery is no longer who they are. They are a free person in that space. And I wonder why we seem to have a harder time with that when it comes to LGBT people, like that, because we have so many verses in the Bible that talk about how slavery is okay, which we know is not true, right? But we do the same thing to LGBT people, where we're like, sure, you can come in, but like you're still an outsider even when you come in, which is not the way that we're supposed to be working. Anyway, a whole tangent. Peacemaker says, you can't be a pastor if you're single in many churches. Yeah, there's the interesting thing in a lot of churches. Like there are some churches in which you can only pastor or, be a priest, for instance, if you are single. And then there are other churches in which having a single pastor is like not okay. So we've got some different things going on there. I lost my train of thought. I got so excited about having to look up things about slavery later. Oh, thanks, Lachlan, for the good recommendation. I'll have to check that out. Okay. So Dan is saying re the gifts that he doesn't. Sorry, Dan, I shouldn't have assumed your pronouns. Since we've met, I feel like I remember you said your pronouns were he and him, but I don't want to assume. Dan said, I don't believe that Paul is creating a hierarchy in terms of gifts. It seems that he's listing roles first, then qualities. Yeah, I think you might be right. Okay, cool. Glad I got your pronouns right, Dan. I think you might be right there, that's why it's so confusing in those verses 27 through 31, because he's kind of listing things out and it makes it seem like a hierarchy, but it might just be that he's saying like, here are the people that live in the church. Like he's just kind of like bullet pointing it down rather than making it a hierarchy. When you all look at this sort of metaphor of the body and sort of the list of gifts we see in verses 27 through 31, are there certain gifts or roles that you feel like you are called toward, or that really resonate with you when you read that sort of list of roles? Is there something that you're like, hey, that's kind of like what I want to do, or that's kind of what I feel called to do? And it doesn't have to be exactly what Paul said, because we've got like a large range. He's sort of listing a few. But is there something in the church that you feel called to do in your community? And actually, I want to expand that even, because a lot of times we can't work in church communities, but maybe within the LGBT community, is there something that you find called to? The list, Raven, is 1 Corinthians 12, and then it's at the end of the chapter, verses 27 through 31. I went on from our bit a little bit. Here, I'll read it again, though. God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then deeds of power, gifts of healing, forms of assistance, forms of leadership, and various kinds of tongues. So is there anything in there that you're like, yeah? Anita says, providing support. Yes, I love that. And while you're all thinking about that, there we go. Oh, hi, Rachel. Rachel says healing. Yeah, that's one of the things that Peacemaker says, I have the gift of giving. That's a great gift. One of the things that I think is so interesting, we know about the people in Corinth, that they were like really attached to speaking in tongues and like the idea of being able to speak in tongues, which some churches still practice today, obviously. But apparently the people in Corinth were like really into it, and they thought that was like the number one gift. And so when Paul is talking to this group of people, it's funny that he lists speaking in tongues as the very last gift. And actually the next chapter of 1 Corinthians 13, is the one that has that whole list of like what love is. And then it's got that bit at the end that says, like, if I have all these gifts, but I have not love, I'm a clanging cymbal. So in that chapter, Paul is specifically speaking to that, where he's saying like, y'all think excuse my language, I don't know if you mind swearing, but y'all think you're hot shit because you can speak in tongues, but like, that's not even the best gift. And so I love that he lists all these things and includes that, but it's not necessarily the best one. Lachlan says, when I was 17 and finished school, I wasn't quite as close with God as I am now, but I felt pushed toward teaching. I was a pretty smart kid in school, and I'm studying mathematics at university and secondary. Now 20, I've been pursuing more roles with my church, like youth leader and such. I'm smart enough and have been told many times to go into finance, but there's more coming there. Raven says teacher. Shannon says teacher. James tells me not to presume to be so. Aw, Shannon. I feel you there. Raven and Shannon, I also feel like teacher is kind of where I get called as well. So the point of thinking about these gifts, Raven says, I'm still trying to figure out what my calling is. Thought I was called to be a teacher, but not sure anymore. I think the reason that it's important to think about these things is because in LGBTQ communities that especially LGBTQ sort of Christian communities, we often don't get asked what we think our gifts are. We often don't get asked to work in the things that we are called to do. And so then we stop thinking about what our gifts might be. And so it's important to think about what our role is in our community, even if we're not able to do it the way we would like to do it in the community we would like to do it with. At least figuring out like what we feel called to do helps us think about how we might provide that role in other communities. So even if you can't do the thing you're called to do in your church, you might be able to do it at a youth center, or you might be able to do it at your community center or at your school or whatever it is. So I think it's really important for us to think about what our gifts might be. Adam says, I too am still figuring out my calling. Yeah, that's definitely, it's a lifelong process, right? Like we might feel called to one thing at one time in our life and called to something else at a different time in our life. So figuring it out is absolutely okay. Dan says, leader and preacher. Marvin says, forms of assistance. I work in my church with IT. Yes, we would be so screwed without the IT people. Raven says, I was a youth leader for a while. I've preached a couple of times. Surprising since my old church is anti-women in leadership. Keep preaching, Raven. Women should definitely still be preaching, in my opinion. Lachlan's just finishing up that thought. I feel like God has called me to teach, and I've gone with that wholeheartedly. What are good positions for teachers so we could support LGBT people in the church? That's a good question, Lachlan. Let me ponder on that one a little bit. And if people in the chat have responses, you should tell Lachlan too. I think teachers are one of the most influential people. This is a dumb thing to say, of course. Teachers are the most influential people in young people's lives other than their parents. And so I think they can do the most to help LGBTQ youth as they're growing up. It's really, really important. Adam says, I'm a musician. Yes, musicians are classic members of the church community and the temple community throughout the Bible. You definitely count. Cool. Okay, where are we on my whole list of questions that I've got here? I've got so many questions for us to talk about. Okay, so here's a question I've got for you. Bill says, a good teacher is honest and open and supportive. Yeah. Ooh, okay. So Lachlan says, how should we react if our church does not want LGBT people in positions when dealing with kids? That is so tough, and it sucks so much because throughout human history, part of the reason that we think LGBT people exist and why we've evolved to have LGBT people in our communities is because we help with childcare, which made our communities more successful. And so historically, that's been one of our main jobs is helping take care of all the kids in our community. And so to not be able to do that really sucks. But I think honestly, if you feel really called to do something like youth ministry or Sunday school ministry with younger kids, I think it's important to find a church that will allow you to do that. And that means maybe not being at a church that's not affirming. And that's a really tough choice to make. I don't throw that out there as a light thing. But it's really, really hard in churches that put that out there, you can't work with kids if you're LGBT. Those are the churches that are going to take the longest time to change, in my experience. And that's really, really tough. So if you want to be with them through that change process, that's amazing and great and wonderful, as long as you're taking care of yourself. But those churches tend to be the ones that are the hardest on LGBT people. Yeah, Lachlan says, if I were to come out, I'd be removed from leadership. Yeah. And Marvin says the same thing. That's very common, and you're definitely not alone in that. I think like I said, one of the best things we can do is cultivate our gifts in spaces where they are welcomed. And so that might mean if you want to stay at your church that won't let you do that, find ways to do that sort of work with kids in other places. And sometimes that's like volunteering at a youth center or something like that. Yeah, it's just tough. It's just tough. It sucks. It sucks to not be able to be in leadership in those churches. And yeah, Shannon says, youth leader for 13 years, forced to leave our church after I came out more publicly about being affirming. Yeah, so sometimes you're not even necessarily LGBTQ yourself. You're just affirming and you get removed from your position. It sucks. And really, like, the biggest thing I can tell you is that there are so many churches out there that will welcome you, and that if you feel called to stay in a position where you're changing things, then more power to you. And like, absolutely, let's like find all the ways we can support you. But know that there are so many churches out there that will let you use your gifts and will let you do what you are called to do. And we can help you find those for sure. Okay, hold on. I got to go back to where we're at here. Adam says, as somebody new to religion and everybody I know is affirming, it's baffling to me that y'all are having this trouble. I didn't imagine that. Yeah. Yeah, I know. For some people, they're like, it's 2019, for goodness sake, get on board. Robin says, how do you explore finding your gifts? That's a good question. I think, Robin, I want to like give you a good book recommendation, and I don't know what to give you yet. I think there are some really good books in like a secular context. I'm trying to think if there are really good ones that I have found in a religious context to talk about religious gifts. In terms of sort of the secular, like how do you find what you're called to do in terms of like larger life? I think some of the most interesting stuff I've seen has come from books on vocation. And so if you've looked up, I'm trying to remember what the name of this book is. Who is it? Parker Palmer, I think. Hold on, let me look. Vocation. I feel like it's Parker Palmer, but I don't remember. Yes, there we go. Parker Palmer, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation. That's like one of the classic books on, it is religious and sort of in a larger life sense at the same time. I haven't personally read it, but I have a lot of friends who read it and said it's really good. So take a look at that. Dan says there are great spiritual gifts inventories online. True. Okay. So here's my sort of last question for us tonight, or maybe second to last. We'll see how much time we have. What members of our LGBTQ community do we need to treat with greater honor and respect? That's my question. What are the members that we are maybe not paying as much attention to within our own LGBTQ plus community that we could find ways to give more respect and honor and support to? Because I think that there are people that we tend to forget about because, like for me, for instance, right, I am I pass as a guy, whatever that means, and I'm white, and I don't have a lot of money, but like I'm, I guess, middle class, sort of, and it's really hard to define middle class these days. Totally random aside, but like for me, I am not the only kind of LGBTQ plus person out there, right? So like what people am I not seeing, or what people am I ignoring or not paying attention to? So what people in our community do we need to be paying more attention to? M says intersex folks. Yes. Raven says trans and non-binary people, especially trans women of color. Yes, trans women of color, being specifically Black, Latinx, and Indigenous trans women, are at such a high rate of violence. They're definitely people we need to be supporting more. Raven says non-passing trans or non-binary folks. Yeah. Toby says I've always thought we need to include more include intersex people more. I agree with you. I've also been reading things lately about some intersex folks specifically not wanting to be included with LGBTQ folks. And so I want to learn more about the sort of diversity of opinions within intersex communities. Because just like not all trans people think the same things about everything, not all intersex people do either. Marvin says, definitely LGBTQ plus, people of color, also intersex and ace folks. Adam says, those with disabilities, they're often seen as inherently asexual, which is uncool. Agreed, Adam. Lynette says ace people. Shannon says aces because it's not every young man's battle. Yeah, true. Dan says, those who are trans and cannot or unable to medically transition. Yeah, that's something that I hear from folks more often than I would have guessed, that there are so many folks that have, for instance, medical issues that won't allow them to transition, that they just can't for medical reasons, even if they want to. And we tend to treat them as if they are not trans enough, which is not cool and wrong. Lachlan says, gay, trans, non-binary, non-gender conforming, etc. Yeah. Oh, Bill says, okay, Bill, I think you're asking the question there on what an ace is. Ace is just short for asexual, and sometimes agender, but mostly asexual. Yes, thank you, Virginia, for putting that in there. Ace is just short, like trans is short. Yeah, so I think one of the things that I have been really heartened by recently. Oh, hold on. I want to read this bit by M. M says, historical note, a lot of intersex activism has been funded and sponsored by trans groups. More intersex orgs are standalone now, but there remains ongoing partnerships. So that might have something to do with sort of the diversity of feelings about being within the LGBTQ plus community. Adam points out that all of the A's, asexual, aromantic, agender, they are all sort of under paid attention to. That's not a way to say that. We don't pay enough attention to those parts of our community. Something that I have been thinking about a lot lately and that I've been really heartened by is I do a lot of research about like new books coming out on trans issues in general. And there are a bunch of books coming out in 2019 about supporting transgender people who are autistic. And it's really cool, or on the autism spectrum. And it's really, really cool to see these new books coming out about, like, they're books for mental health professionals, but also for just like general population reading. And I know quite a few people that are on the autism spectrum and are trans. And it's really cool to see that part of our population finally getting some support. So that's your good news of the day, that we're getting more resources out there for people. Okay. I think I've got more questions, but I think that's like kind of a nice place to end tonight. So does anybody else have any last thoughts before we get going? Any last thoughts on this idea of, in 1 Corinthians 12, of the body and how we are seen in the body? I think the thing that I really wanted to bring home is this idea that we are all necessary and that we all have our gifts, and that exploring what our gifts might be is a really good way to be in community with each other. So if there are any other thoughts that y'all have about that, throw them in the chat before we go home, before we all say goodnight or good morning, whatever time you're in. I always feel like I have to talk so fast in these chats, or in these, I guess they are chats. Whew. And then I get to the end and I'm like, drink some water, chill out. One of these days I'm going to do a chill stream. Lachlan says, how often do you stream? This is the first one I've been in. So Lachlan, the plan is to do two, and this is a great thing I should have said before, to do 2 Bible study streams a month. So we'll have this one and then one more in January. And then in between those weeks, so it'll be every other week. In between those weeks, I have a group for trans folks, anybody who identifies as agender, non-binary, trans man, trans woman, whatever you identify as. If you are if you are not cisgender, you're welcome. But it's a support group where we all just get together. I send out a link and we get together and we video chat with each other. And you can do video chat or audio chat. So if you don't want to be on video, that's totally fine. But we do those on the Wednesdays, the alternating Wednesdays in between these Bible studies. And if you want to be involved in those and you are a gender diverse person, I'm going to put the link in the chat below. It's really easy. If I say it's really easy and then I can't copy this. Okay. If you want to get involved with that support group, it's bit.ly/transchristian support is the sign up. And when you go to the sign up page, it'll have like the rules for like, here's what we promise to do. We promise to not talk about people outside this group. We promise that we are a gender nonconforming person and this is like part of our community, that kind of thing. So if you want to get involved in that, we are meeting next Wednesday at the same time, 8 p.m. Central. And I'll send out a link for that. And then the weekend or the week after that, so that'll be Wednesday the 23rd, will be our next Bible study. So come back here Wednesday the 23rd, 8 p.m. Central, other times on other coasts. And we're going to have another Bible study. So thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. This is so much fun to do. I don't know what our next Bible study topic is going to be yet. So if you have feelings about what passages we should look at, drop them in the comments on this video, and I will take a look and see what we've got out there. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. This was great. I hope you all have a wonderful night. I hope you're all doing well, and we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks. Cool. See y'all next time.